Hello, welcome everybody to the Global Design Forum London Design Festival. Today's session will focus on the built environment, and it's the third of five sessions happening daily this week as part of the Circular Design Project, a collaboration between the London Design Festival, SAP, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the aim of which is to give a unique insight into global circular economy, the global circular economy. My name is Dominic. I'm a freelance design journalist. I've written a couple of books, and I would like now to introduce or ask my four speakers today to introduce themselves. Can I first ask you, Amanda Levete, to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Amanda Levite. I'm an architect based in London, and my practice is called ALA.
Thank you. Thomas Rao of Rao Architects. Please, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Thomas Rao. I'm an architect, and I have an architecture office in Amsterdam. And in the last 10 years, we are specialized on circular design.
Great, thank you. And Carol Lemmens, please could you, from ARUP, please could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello everyone, my name is Carol Lemmens, working at ARUP as a global advisory service leader, and I've been leading ARUP's aspiration around circular economy for the last 5 years and worked a lot together with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation.
Thank you. And Tom Raftery, Global Vice President at SAP. Please, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Dominic. As you said, my name is Tom Raftery. I work for SAP. In my role in SAP, I am a futurist and innovation evangelist. So I am the non-architect in the room.
Right, okay, thank you very much. Now, I've got a set of questions to ask everyone. My first one is quite a broad one, but how does the circular design approach come into play for the existing environment and for new buildings that will last decades? And what are the tools and technologies that can help enable this? Now, I don't know who might want to ask this first, but perhaps I could ask you, Tom, to kick off with your views on this.
Sure, thanks, Dominic. Yeah, it's a good pair of questions, I guess. How does the design approach, circular design approach, come into play in existing built environment? Well, if we look, there are some extremely good examples of this. I mean, there's a great example in Barcelona, a place called La Fábrica. I'm based in Spain, so I know a few of these things. La Fábrica is Spanish for the factory. And La Fábrica is a project that was done by an architect called Ricardo Bofill, where he converted what was an existing cement factory into an apartment for himself, guest bedrooms, offices, all that kind of thing. It took extensive redesign, but to the point, it repurposed an already existing building rather than requiring the rebuild of a new building. But in taking the second part of the question, what are the tools and technologies that can help enable kind of circular economies in the built environment? There's all kinds of technologies. There's things like building information modeling. There's material passports. There's strategies as well around whether you have short or long life components and which kind of strategies you adopt for all of those kind of things. And more in my own wheelhouse, the kind of technology area, you have the idea of using things like product as a service technologies, where instead of selling actual products, which is what we've done traditionally for centuries, you sell the utility of that product. And why is that important? Well, if you think about you are building a factory for the components that are used in the factory, if you have to buy them, obviously it's a big upfront cost, but the flip side of it is if you get them as a service, in other words, if the manufacturer gives them to you for free and you rent the use of them, then what happens is the manufacturer is getting back information from those machines, and that information is important for billing purposes, number one. because you're using them as a service, so you're being charged for the use of them, so they need to get that information back. But also, for the first time now, the manufacturer of the machine also gets back the information on the use of that machine. And why is that important? Well, that information, for the first time going back to the manufacturer, allows the manufacturer to see how the machine is actually being used in real life, as opposed to previously them having to guess about the operating environment, about how many hours a day it's used, and what temperatures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're getting actual data back from the machine, and this operating data can be fed back into the design aspect at the very start of what was traditionally a linear model. So if it goes back into the design, the next version of the machine becomes even better because it's designed for how the machine is actually being used. And this can be anything in the built environment, from cars to air compressors to street lights. There's a great example. The city of Los Angeles doesn't own any street lights. All the street lights in Los Angeles are owned by Signify. Signify is the new name for the former Philips lighting. So Signify owns all the street lights in the city of Los Angeles, and they charge the city of Los Angeles not for the lights, but for the lumens of light delivered by those lights. So, there are some great examples in the built environment of this kind of thing going on.
Great, thank you very much. Because I think you've also had a project with Philips, haven't you?
Yeah, multiple.
But maybe we can talk about that later on. Great. Okay, Amanda, would you have any comments, please, on this subject?
Yeah, well, I'd like to take a slightly different tack, and right. I believe that the tools lie within us, and by that I mean that we have to take both personal responsibility and collective responsibility as a profession to deal with the issues around the circular economy and the reduction of waste and the reduction of pollution in as best way as we can, and to persuade our clients of the importance of doing this. And I think the other, fundamental tool that we have is to always ask the right question. And the most important question that we have to ask at the outset of a project is, do we really need this? What is this for? Do we need to build? Or can we reuse and reappropriate and repurpose what is already there? And if we do have to rebuild, how can we use materials that are recycled and that we can bring a new life to something that has otherwise been discarded?
Right. That's very interesting. Thank you, Amanda. And Carol, would you have a comment to make about this on this subject?
Yes, as said by Tom, it's actually a series of questions, and they might be framed in one row, because we are all looking for a kind of holy grail. How does circular economy look like, and how does circular design look like? And in the last 5 years, I've seen a kind of certain stages where not only myself and my firm as designers and engineers and economists, etc., went through, but also the whole industry, where we have gradually migrated from initially a kind of material strategy to a design strategy to a business strategy to a strategy where we also come up with different financial and economic models. And what Amanda was saying, I really liked, it is about taking a view on circular economy from each position in the whole, if you like, value chain, all the stakeholders, all the people involved in, for example, developing a building or creating a part of a city or developing part of the infrastructure. The interesting thing is that if you're looking at the essence of circular economy, these circles, which you often can see in all sorts of diagrams, they're actually already reflecting that, as long as you can keep materials or buildings or assets at the highest value, at the highest use, that's the kind of starting point. And the more you cannot reuse them, or you cannot have other purposes, then we go into recycling and incineration, which is only the last resort. Right. What we have discovered is aligning all those people that are contributing to a building or contributing to a road, having these dialogues in place and make sure that you really are willing and able as a team to rethink how design should look like, how you actually address the real value in existing assets, for example, not just assuming that everything is waste, but really identifying the real value. And for example, looking at other assets as donor buildings, or looking at different purposes, or not dealing with abundance, but dealing with scarcity actually, or really are really able to rethink your design principles, like design for deconstruction, rather thinking that everything can be made because we have a wealth of technical opportunities. These things are really important, that the team develops a mindset that we really have to rethink and take responsibility on everything we design or build. So if the original designers, the original constructors, or original suppliers take responsibility of what they've delivered, and do it in such a way, they say, well, at the end of the first life cycle, I take it back, then you can get into these schemes like products or buildings as a service, or thinking about material banks, or thinking about real value of the assets we're developing at better value. So the last few years, I've been focusing mainly on what is this real value. And we're looking at more total value aspect, which is not only financial, but also looking at societal value. And how can you factor that in the circular design? Or looking at economical value, which goes beyond financial. This is also about the quality of a living environment. It's about health and well-being. So be much more inclusive and much more systemic in it, we think. And every design decision or construction decision we make, that it has an impact on a wider system, and understand what it is, and really be very careful to avoid too much negative externalities. I think that's a very important mindset almost in how circular economy design, production, services, financial construct should work.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I think the word mindset is a very interesting one that you just mentioned, and I would like to ask Thomas, as well as probably Amanda and Tom, because the circular economy, one of the main underlying things about it, it seems to me, is that it's about a change of mindset. Embracing the circular economy is about a sort of paradigm shift away from the linear economy towards a whole new way of thinking. Thomas, what is your, and also the mindset of the clients as well, you know, is it difficult to change the mindset of clients sometimes, or to ask them to approach things in that way, in the circular economy way? Thomas, what is your view on that?
I'm very happy that you mentioned that. It's I think mind change is much more important than climate change. And the question is not sustainable design, the question is circular design. And maybe it's good to start, what is the difference at all between sustainable and circular design at all? Because everywhere, everybody's using everything. I think sustainability means we are optimizing what we are doing. It's optimizing the system. We reduce energy, we reduce material. So it's about reduction. But at the end of reduction, there is, you have nothing or nothing changed. Circularity is about facilitating responsibility. So we have to create a new value, a new chain, a value creation chain where we facilitating responsibility. And why is this so important? Maybe we can make the question even one level bigger. I mean, if we realize that the context where we are, and we are on this planet, and the Earth is the biggest monopolist ever, then we have to realize that everything which is here is limited. So all materials on this planet are limited. On the other side, our being is temporary, everything is temporary, and our needs are temporary. So every building, like the building beside me, is a temporary answer for a temporary need. So maybe in 50 or 100 years, this building, maybe it doesn't exist anymore. So we have to realize that the building is a temporary component. And that means we have to change the design in a way that all the materials we need in the building, that we connect all the materials in a way that every building is becoming a material depot. So because we need the same materials for the next generation for other temporary needs. And I think this is very important to talk about the material question. So how can we save the material in the building environment? And Tom, you mentioned light as a service. We developed this 9 years ago for Philips, so we were the first office in the world.
Excuse me, I apologize that I attributed this to Tom when I should have attributed the Philips project to you. Just want to make that clear, because I mentioned it in the context of Tom, when in fact I should have mentioned it in the context of you. Yeah. So apologies for that.
Yeah. I just want to mention that we have now business models where is power and responsibility separate, because the power is for the producer and the responsibility is for the user.
Yeah.
The service model, which is mentioned, brings together power and responsibility. I think this is very important, even in the circular economy. And by the way, a circular building doesn't exist. We creating buildings with a circular potential, and it depends on the people in the future if they want to disassemble the building or if they want to destroy the building. So a circular building, in my opinion, doesn't exist.
Right, right. But can I ask you, Amanda, if you agree that a certain change in mindset is in order for the circular economy to be embraced by developers and clients and so on, how do you think that to what extent are developers and your clients prepared to embrace this change in mindset in your experience?
Well, I have to be super honest here. We have done almost no work for developers, so that's not my experience. But from looking around at what developers build in the commercial sector, it is hard to believe that they are actually really engaged in this issue, because we have enough building stock in cities right now, and a lot of it is unused or not being used to capacity or redundant. And I don't see much commitment to really addressing that. We're still in London putting up a lot of commercial high-rise offices, which particularly post-COVID, I think are highly questionable as a model, as a place that anybody frankly wants to work, let alone should work. So I think there needs to be a huge mindset change in the developers. A lot of my clients come from the kind of cultural public sector, and they are highly engaged in this issue and highly committed, because the money for these projects comes from the public purse, and they have a huge responsibility to spend money wisely. So they are very engaged and very sophisticated in their understanding of the issues.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Tom, I would like to ask you, you know, because I believe that you provide information through your database, is that correct? In terms of supply chains and that sort of thing, you know, I hesitate to use the word sustainable in view of what Tom said, but, you know, circular economy supply chains. Do you see a sort of much bigger uptake on this recently, or on people wanting to be informed? And what is your view on that?
So it's a little more complicated than that. Okay. So we provide information systems for companies of all sizes in all aspects. We cover 26 different industries, you know, everything from airlines to hotels to shops to train operators to, you know, you name it, we develop software for them. We have thousands of software products to cover all aspects. But has there been an uptake in interest in sustainability? Yeah, there has. I think Thomas covered it very well, you know, alluding to the fact that we live on a planet of finite resources, and we have temporary needs that we are harvesting these resources irresponsibly for, and we have to do better than that. I don't know who the quote is from, but I love this quote where they say, "There is no away." And, you know, when you talk about throwing something away, there isn't an away. Away is not a place. It basically, you're talking about putting it in a landfill, and obviously that is hugely, hugely wasteful. And the whole idea of circular design and circular economy is to massively, massively, massively reduce waste. Is to reuse everything as much as possible so that the limited finite resources we have, we're not squandering them, we're using them as responsibly as possible.
Thank you, thanks. I mean, an important part of the circular economy seems to be, as Amanda has touched on just now, on the idea of repurposing and using existing architecture, existing buildings. I'm just wondering in what way you could name some examples, Amanda and also Thomas in turn, about you know, how this affects the choice of materials you use in the first place, you know, and also construction methods, whether you favor off-site construction, modular construction, all of these sort of aspects of the circular economy that apply to architecture. Could I ask you, Amanda, whether you are in, you know, what your sort of methodologies are in that respect?
Well, but before I answer the kind of specific, I'd like to make a kind of broader point, sure. Which is, in a sense, I mean, the circular economy is a new way of articulating something. But actually, if you look at cities, the success of a city is the result of centuries of reuse and reappropriation. And buildings are constantly being reappropriated and reused. And there's nothing new in that. And that is very much the kind of dynamic of the city. And it's, you know, change is the one constant in cities, and change is the engine of progress. So this kind of constant reappropriation of buildings is extremely healthy, but has been going on for centuries. So we can't kind of claim it as our own. Yeah. In terms of methodology, I think, you know, it is an incredibly complex issue, and there is no blueprint, and there is no one kind of data bank that helps us to make the right decision, because it is so complex and because it is constantly changing and evolving. And I think it's important that you take each project as its own piece and see how this idea and this notion of circular economy is relevant to that particular building, to its purpose, in its particular geography, in its particular city. There is no one way of approaching it.
Right. Okay.
Although I think that Thomas would probably disagree with me.
Well, Thomas, do you want to put your view across then? I would be interested to hear what you think.
No, I think the time to build buildings is over. I think we have to organize a logistic process with the result, a building. Because if a building is a depot of material, and that's what we have to design because the materials are limited, and to create a depot is a logistic process. And I want to come back what Tom said about waste. I mean, we have to eliminate waste because you can throw it away. Of course not, because the context is a closed system, so you can throw it away. So some years ago, we thought about what is waste. And in fact, we think waste is material without an identity and anonymity. And if we give then all materials in the building or every building a material passport, so we write down what kind of materials are in this building, where are they from, what is the quality, how much is it, then we have a passport and we can register it. There is an online public platform called Moderator. And Moderator is a cadastre for material. So in Moderator, it's a public platform to register your materials in your building. So then, because if a material has a registered identity, it will never be waste. So I think in the combination SRP, it's about data. So with the data, we can eliminate waste forever if we register all limited editions which we need to serve the temporary needs.
Right, thanks. Now, this might be going slightly off-piste, but I'm wondering if one of the sort of obstacles to the this changing in mindset is a financial one, because perhaps there is a lot to be gained financially for building new buildings, using new materials and so on. Carol, would you have any views on this, this topic?
Yeah, so actually this connects quite well to a latest research piece we did together with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where we talked about what is the real value of circular economy, and actually addressing the kind of how value looks like for each of the parties involved. So what does it mean for, what do we mean by value for a developer or a contractor or an owner? And what you see often happen is that if some of behavior, current behavior in how we design and construct buildings in the current situation is driven by what kind of economic and financial metrics underneath. And we have in Dutch this kind of initial rate of return, which means we look at moment zero to what did we invest, what is the expected rent incomes or the incomes for lenders, and that's how we decide on our investments. We hardly look at the life cycle cost, the life cycle. What if we can improve the life cycle of a component? Will it have a higher returns on investment? So, what we did an interesting exercise on what if we take into account all costs, all investment, but also all revenues across the life cycle, and would then certain cases look better than others? And actually, what we could address, and I would really invite everyone to look at a report where we prototyped almost the different business models. We identified 5 of them for circular business models. We could demonstrate that the internal rates of returns became more interesting, up to 3 or 4%, which is a massive amount if you take it over 30 or 40 years for the first life cycle. So what it unlocked was actually the big interest of, for example, developers who were being forced to look in a different way to how they sell actually the value of the assets they are developing to investors. This is driven also by whole new investment taxonomies, which we now all see appear, like the green on the back of the Green Deal, or if you're looking at green finance platforms, where we start increasingly to look at what is actually the value if we do things differently, and can we think a bit about more profitable, if you like, business models. And it's fairly broadly seen now that these circular business models also have a better financial outcome. The question, of course, is if we should only look at financial, but it certainly helps in making certain decisions. So if we can demonstrate that, for example, the appreciation of an asset is better by lenders so that they want to pay more rent, or if we can reduce improve occupancy rates so that we have less idle offices, for example, as Amanda was mentioning, then at a certain moment the whole game changes to an interest in do things differently. So earlier it was mentioned the light as a service from Signify. I know the biggest hurdle was in the beginning, from what I saw, and Thomas may have more insights on this one, but when I talked to some of the directors there, is how to convince investors and people who have to take the initial investments to convince that this is a better case on the longer term, whilst the whole mindset was short-term revenues within a year. You know, that's how we have to report to shareholders and in annual reports. So you now see a shift also in how annual reports should be written. What are the KPIs? How does a resilient asset portfolio look like? And we now see there's a kind of change going on at financial institutions, some more upfront than others, like ABN AMRO or Intesa Sanpaolo or HSBC. There's more interest in developers say, hey, that's interesting. Can I make a different case to be different from my fellow developers who still have the old-fashioned way of looking at outcomes and value? And we see also, if we have these different kind of outcomes, that there's a kind of more space for investments in new technologies, new production, and even appreciating that sometimes not taking the easiest access to materials, like reusing materials, can be beneficial if the longer term returns on investment are better. So where we as professionals, and perhaps sometimes the evangelist, I heard as a term, say, well, it doesn't make sense not to be sustainable, not to do circular economy. There's a whole cohort of people in industries that need to be convinced. And well, unfortunately, still in the modern world, money talks. But if we talk money in a different way, rather than short term, but be able to talk longer term, and if we can include social value and monetize social value in terms of better livability, hence better price for ground, better. So then also the economics start to turn. And I think that is also what you see going from a design strategy or material strategy, that we put more emphasis on the essence of the economy. So circular economy has a second E, but till now we hardly focus on the E. And I think that one should be more be part of the conversations to really drive new models.
But I think that, you know, you talk about the end of year report and the kind of financial metrics. I think it's, and coming back to Dominic, your question about, you know, how do we change, if changing the mindset, as Thomas said, is the most important, the most difficult thing to do. And I think we have to understand as a society that the kind of quality of life has a value that you can't put a price to, and not everything has to be defined by a financial metric. And if there was an obligation for corporations, for institutions to give that the bandwidth that it needs, and for them to be judged as a company and reputationally as well, not just on their financial profitability, but the contribution that they make to the quality of life for the people who inhabit their buildings or who work in their buildings.
Yeah, I fully agree.
There's kind of a way to do that.
Yeah, Tom, yes, I'd love to hear.
So, a couple of points. Carol talked about the and we've referenced it a few times, the Signify story with Los Angeles and selling light as a service. That had to happen. That had to happen for Philips/Signify, because they were shifting from incandescent bulbs, which had a lifetime measured in tens to hundreds of hours, to LED light bulbs, which have a lifetime of tens of thousands of useful hours. And the purchase price of an LED is probably 10 times that of an incandescent. But for Philips, you sell it once, and you're not going to sell a replacement for 20 years. So they had to find a way of getting over that loss of revenue. So instead of selling them, they give them and then they charge during that 20 years lifetime of the bulb for the use of the bulb. It means for the city or whoever the customer is, they don't have the upfront hit of the 10 times price increase of the LED bulb, but then they get a longer lifetime use of that bulb. So it's a win-win for everyone. Yeah. And to Amanda's point about changing the economics, I think one of the ways, and changing the mindsets, I think one of the ways of doing that is to our point, put a price on it. The polluter pays principle. And one of the biggest ways of doing that, someone raised it in the chat. I have the chat window open here beside me. They talked about the price or the cost of concrete, not the financial cost, but the actual energy cost. And of course, a way to, and the carbon cost, a way to hit on that is to put a price on carbon. So again, the polluter pays principle. If we have a carbon price, a significant one, then the use of carbon, you would imagine, would have to decrease. So we try and do it by changing the economics. I know we have the EU ETS scheme here in Europe right now, but the price of carbon is still too low. So that needs to go up and we need to drive it up.
Great, thank you. I mean, I don't know whether one of the issues here, I don't know whether you agree or not, might be about perhaps an old-fashioned idea that things have to be owned to start with, so, that the ownership of the lighting system, the actual physical object plus the energy would have to be owned in the first place. Whereas what you're saying is that the more sort of, the energy and the lights being produced can be, one element, and another element would be the structure that is, the actual lights, the sort of infrastructure rather than the energy.
Yeah, when you go down the product as a service route, the incentive for the manufacturer to build in obsolescence goes away. So suddenly things get a much longer lifespan, and they become far more efficient, and they are taken back at the end of their life, hopefully to be repurposed and rebuilt into a new product to go back out again to have another significant lifetime.
Right. Now, I mean, a sort of a major question that I wonder whether I can ask you, it's a very big topic, but how could one, you know, we're talking about the built environment, so how can we talk, do you have some ideas about how cities could be designed in a circular economy fashion in future? Thomas, I mean, you've talked about, you know, reusing buildings, and also I'd like to hear Amanda's view as well. But could you talk, Thomas, about how, you know, some sort of broad brush ideas about how cities could be designed in the future and following a circular economy philosophy?
I think it's very close to the mindset question you just mentioned. I mean, you never can change the mindset of someone. The only one who can change the mindset, it's you. So you have to do this out of freedom. You can give some financial incentive to stimulate this. But the service model is one step in the good direction, because if you don't own the stuff and you just can use it, you realize that you can't identify yourself with what you have, but it's all about who you are. So in fact, the goal is in fact a kind of a spiritual question. That's what we have to answer. And that means we have to think about cities in a different way, because the city is exactly the same. It's a temporary component for our social life. And that means we need another mixture between offices and culture and living houses. We have to do it in a different way. But my question is, do we need cities at all in the future? Because everything what is facilitated in the cities in the last 100 years, I can do this with my laptop somewhere in the bush. So in fact, for all these needs, for all my old needs, I don't need a city. So the question, what is the new cultural task for a city for the future? And for that, I think we have to rethink city from scratch on. Okay, and
I mean, Amanda, you, I don't know, what do you think of the sort of changing panorama? Do you think there is a change? You mentioned COVID. You know, there's going to be a change in panorama, presumably, in the way that, you know, cities are designed in future, buildings are adapted, or a greater adoption of existing buildings?
I mean, I just want to, I really profoundly disagree with you, Thomas, about, you know, we don't need cities. We do need cities. Cities are places of opportunity, places of networking, of connection, of culture. I think that the kind of, I think there's particularly what COVID has kind of highlighted and thrown into sharp focus is the importance of local, and to be more conscious of local. And perhaps that then means breaking down the city into smaller pieces, not having these great kind of mega cities. But I believe passionately in the role that the city has to play in the life of our species. I mean, we are, you know, as a species, we are defined by our ability to socialize and cooperate, and it happens at its most intensely in cities. And I think that the kind of remoteness and distance that we have all experienced during this pandemic threatens the very kind of core of our cultural life. And we have learned that we need people. We don't need to be with each other all of the time, but we need to be with each other.
Amanda, can I ask you, what's your thought on the idea of the kind of 15-minute city that Barcelona has, you know, that everything is within a kind of 15-minute radius of you?
I think it's a wonderful idea, and there's a lot of work happening in Paris at the moment, and this idea that all of your daily needs can be met within a 15-minute walk. You know, it's hardly a kind of new idea, and it certainly was the case when I was growing up, but, you know, your children's school is a 15-minute walk away rather than a 45-minute drive away. I mean, that's it. And that, you know, within 15 minutes, you can access sporting facilities and all your shopping needs and
parks,
a cinema, and, you know, it's a very nice way of putting it. And and that's in a way what I mean about the idea of breaking down the city into smaller pieces. But, there's still a kind of a huge benefit in a city being made up of lots of different places, and the kind of the scale of it and the scope of it and the different districts is what makes a city like London so vibrant, so diverse, and such a great place to live.
Amanda, I agree. Of course, we need places to socialize, but we shouldn't concentrate it in the city. We should decentralize this. That's my point.
Okay. Carol, do you have any thoughts on this subject, on how, are we going to witness a different panorama now in how cities are designed?
Yes, I do think. Yes, I do think. Well, not only by circular economy, but one thing we have to acknowledge: we can fight against the number of cities and urbanization, but it's a fact that about 70% of the world population will live in cities in a few years' time. So we can fight against it, but I don't think that's a reasonable road. What I do see is that the views on how we develop cities is really shifting, and I think the example of Barcelona is almost underpinning the concept that we need different kind of infrastructure in a city, lesser roads, more other transport modalities, lesser cars. What you see is that the interesting thing about cities is that there's increasing understanding that cities also have a responsibility in developing, if you like, the right sort of brief in how we set up cities, how we regenerate parts of the city, how we, if we weave in new parts of the city, how we do that in a much more responsible way than we did probably 10 years ago, and bringing back equality. And I think if we're looking at circular economy, again, it's not only about materials, it's also about a value you create, a qualitative environment where it's better living, where it's better collaborating, where it's better socializing together. And I think there's a big role for designers, and I'm not a designer myself, but I see on a daily basis thousands of my colleagues working on that we say, okay, what's the human scale in which a city is livable? How we can change the setup in such a way that there's much more place for green. An interesting research we recently did is if we use green roofs, we can decrease the number of equipment we need to cool down the buildings, because it's green roofing. If you do it a substantial way, it decreases the average temperature of a city, which decreases energy uses, which decreases the need for equipment, so we don't need to build it. We can develop our buildings differently.
And it increases biodiversity.
Yes, if we're looking at Singapore, where they really have a place for green, that's a very intelligent way of thinking about the climate of a city, which is connected to materials, which is connected to well-being, which is connected to safety, even these kind of parameters. So cities, there's increasing responsibility that cities are taking. And if you have a kind of forward-going mayor, and well, some cities were already mentioned, then you see that they set the agenda. They don't delegate this to a sustainability department, but they want to cut this across every department of a city. Everyone has to contribute to this more livable, sustainable, whatever environment we want to call this. And I think cities is a place where a lot of things come together, and that's what. So they have an important role to play in the transition.
And I think this is a hugely important point. We need to, in cities, bring nature closer to us. And yes, it helps cool, and it helps insulate, and it brings biodiversity, but it also provides solace, and it provides joy, and it makes us look at the kind of rhythm of life in a slightly different way. And so it's all of these things that are a little bit intangible that are as important as the ones that we can measure.
Yeah, perhaps can I add one example which is connecting to what you're saying? I was recently in New Zealand, and there the circular economy is not mentioned, named as circular economy, but the native speak the original inhabitants of the city have with living with nature. So circular economy is not being used as circular economy. They use the original way how human being related to nature and how they created their living environment. And I think that's an interesting metaphor what you were mentioning, Amanda. I just couldn't resist mentioning that.
Okay, can I quickly ask Tom, can you give some pointers yourself about how you see cities in the future developing in a way that conforms more to the circular economy idea?
Sure. Yeah. No, I was just going to build on what Carol was saying there, because he mentioned reduction in the number of cars, for example. And there's, of course, a great example of that coming from Amsterdam, where in the mayoral elections of, I think it was 2018, the winning candidate won on a platform of taking 10,000 car parking spaces away in the city. And particularly along the canals and places like that. So if you're going down the canal in a boat, you're not looking at the front of cars as you look left and right, but rather you're seeing they're being replaced with benches so people can sit at the side of the canal. They're being replaced in streets where there was car parking spaces before, to Amanda and Carol's points as well. They're now putting plants out and putting in places for kids to play and making the city in general more livable. Cities of the future are going to have to go that way. We have to get rid of personal transportation, or at least significantly reduce it, because cars cause so many problems. Everything from road traffic accidents to air quality issues to noise pollution. Some of those can be addressed by the electrification of transportation, sure, and that will happen as well. Even not just personal transportation, but the electrification of buses, the electrification of refuse collection vehicles. I mentioned refuse collection vehicles because of the three classes of vehicles that consume the most fuel. The number one is 18-wheel trucks, number two is buses, and number three is refuse collection vehicles. And of course, buses and refuse collection vehicles operate primarily in urban environments, causing pollution from the fuel they use, causing noise from burning that fuel. And so electrifying those will have a huge, significant increase in air quality in cities, a reduction in noise pollution, and as well as that, generally make the city more livable. Problems there are charging infrastructure for those vehicles, and some of that's being addressed as well. There's a company called Ubitricity who, if I remember correctly, are working with Siemens to put charging infrastructure into lamp posts on street sides, because lamp posts already have electricity going to them, and they're using less electricity now because they're being switched from incandescent bulbs to LEDs, so there is enough electricity in them already going there to charge a car. And if you're street side parking, that's an option there. So there's all kinds of things like that to make cities more livable, and cities of the future are going to be going that way. But yeah, getting rid of personal transportation is going to be a big one. Switching people to bikes, getting rid of car parking spaces, making sidewalks wider, putting in cycle lanes. Here in Seville, where I live, there's a fantastic cycle lane infrastructure where the cycle lanes are physically separated from the roads. If you're in a car and you want to hit someone in a bike lane, you have to destroy the car to do so. It's really, really hard because there are concrete bollards separating you from the bike lanes, which means for kids, it's really, really, really safe. And they rolled out a bike share scheme here in Seville. And every time they put out a new station with the bikes, they wouldn't light it up until it had 200 meters going either direction of those bike lanes getting to another station. So, it was really well thought out. So those kinds of things are things that are important for cities of the future.
Right. So thank you very much, Tom. We've only got about 5 minutes, I'm afraid. But I wonder whether, how optimistic or pessimistic, if this isn't too big a question, do people feel about the switch of mentality and mindset that's required? Does anyone have any thoughts about?
I'm a glass half full person.
Can anyone? Amanda, what's your feeling? Are you positive about the future of this?
Yeah, well, I'm an optimist, and we are. The fact that we're having this conversation, which is just one of many conversations going on around the globe at the moment, is cause for optimism. But I just think that, I keep trying to look back in history, and I think a lot of what we're talking about, we just use different language now. And I was thinking about, when we have to ask ourselves the big question, do we need this? Do we really need it? There was Cedric Price, who's a wonderful architect who started out in the 1960s. He famously said that a couple would be better advised to get a divorce than to build their dream house. And in a way, that could be, we could pose the question, do you really need it? And that could be the answer. And I think it's a sort of very lateral way of thinking. that we need to embrace as part of our kind of tool of for working.
Great, thanks. Thomas, in 1 minute, could you give your feelings positively or negatively about this?
I will do it shorter.
Okay.
I'm very optimistic because history shows we just need one people for big change. So everything started with one people, and from this one we have more than 7 billion people, so I'm very optimistic. And this crisis shows everything can change in one night. We can change everything in one night. And this is, I think, the very good message of this crisis.
A little bit drastic, but yes, I mean, if that's the effect it has. Carol, what's your feeling?
Yeah, so I'm a realist, and I'm optimistic that we make a change. And if I compared five years ago to now, a lot of things have happened since the first Circular House and 5 years ago the London Design Festival, and now a lot of things have happened. But I'm also optimistic because it's a generational. We can also rely on next generation. So where we need to change our mindset. My daughters of 18 already think it's just should be done, and they actually find us that we should be more accountable for our deeds, and they want to change this. So I think this will take generations to really make it full circle or whatever. But I'm optimistic that the next generation will keep us really at pace and make things that happen. So I'm relatively optimistic. Yeah.
I think you've got a good point about the generational shift, hopefully. And Tom, do you think this requires a bit more education in terms of persuading people about the circular economy, or is it, you think it's just going to be a natural kind of progression in that direction?
That's a good question. Generally, I am optimistic to your earlier question. I think, yeah, very definitely we will require to educate, particularly people of our generation, because as Carol rightly pointed out, the younger generation, the younger generation are already on board. But unfortunately, a lot of the decisions aren't made by them, but they're made by our generation. And, you've seen what that's led to.
It's funny though, because we had the words of disposable society a while ago, but we need to get rid of this disposable society view, I suppose, as well. Anyway, thinking to conclude there. So thank you very much for everyone for your very interesting points, and very much enjoyed talking to everyone and hearing all your views.
Thanks, Dominic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic.